author, entrepreneur, pundit, thinker, and generally verbose human being, Jonah Goldberg, joining me, author of Liberal Fascism, The Suicide of the West, co-founder and editorial director, editor-in-chief,
Editor-in-chief, I think.
editor-in-chief of The Dispatch, and any other. And
I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where I hold the Cliff Asness Chair in Applied Liberty.
And committed persnickety verbophile who may or may not dig into the question of what is conservatism. Yes, which is something that we've recently discussed with your friend and dashboard saint Yuval Levine.
And I have to admit, I don't think I've heard the word verbophile in quite a while. Is that one who loves speaking? Is that what it?
Love of would it be love of words?
Love of words.
Let's talk about how you got into this world of punditry and words. And I mean, I don't need to say it to you because I know how much you hate compliments, and my listeners have heard me talk about you before, so they know how much you have been formative to my own intellectual upbringing in the context of the American political world thinking. So I'll save those adulations for another time. I respect your boundaries. So let's do tell us, how did you get into the world of political writing, and how do you compare the environment of media, intellectual political media, that you entered to where you are now?
Sure. We don't have to do the full origin story, but I grew up in a very media focused kind of family, both for professionally and by choice, in terms of like the pastime of my family was reading things. And even though I was not a voracious reader compared to some people, my dad, again, partly because he was an editor, I think we subscribed at home to 11 newspapers and 20 magazines. That was that kind of place. And grew up all of it, never wanted to go into it. I wanted to write science fiction or comic books when I grew up, and then discovered when I went to college that mostly through osmosis, I had absorbed an enormous amount of politics stuff, and kind of fell over backwards into being into politics in college, and then was the editor of the school paper, and my first job in Washington after a brief stint of teaching English in Prague was where I went to Prague wanting to be a starving writer. I batted 500. I didn't starve and I didn't write, and came home, got a job as a researcher at the American Enterprise Institute in the very early 1990s. And that was sort of my catch-up grad school. I happened to be with at that time, AEI was full of Straussian scholars and neoconservative foreign policy people. We can get into my correct but fairly esoteric views on neoconservatism. Robert Bork was there. Jean Kirkpatrick was there. Those kinds of people. Irving Kristol was a huge influence on me, was there. And I was surrounded by kids who had went to much better colleges and were much more academically inclined. And again, through osmosis, I was determined to fill up a lot of the gaps in my education, and became kind of obsessed with the intellectual history of conservatism and the intellectual history of American public intellectuals. And that put me on a rabbit hole I've been on ever since. Left AEI in the late 90s to go to National Review, where I was the founding editor of National Review Online. And again, it was a different tribe of conservatives than the ones I had been with, growing up and at AEI, but it was very close cousins. And I just sort of leapt into that stuff even more.
So I mean, to get just past the mere biography, like, yes, what was the thread that kind of connected the I don't know, the mood, the ideas, the vibes that made you want to get into that world and say, like, fuck the comic books?
Yeah, well, I still, if I ever had, the kind of fuck you money that would be required, I'd rather still to this day go back and write comic books and sci-fi novels. But Part of it, I think I've talked about this before, but there's a weird overlap with a lot of comic book nerds and intellectual history nerds, and I think the shaded part of the Venn diagram is a bizarre interest and fascination with origin stories. And it's one of the reasons why, one of my gateway drugs was this book, um, very influential book on the right, by a guy named Charles Nash, um, called the American Intellectual, the Conservative, the American Conservative Intellectual Movement since 1945. And a big chunk of that book is just origin stories of like, how did these people fall into this universe? And that's one of the reasons why I loved that book and found it really compelling. And so I think you know, that's part of it, is this way of looking how at other people were it's that merger of biography and the seduction of ideas that I just always thought was really interesting. And um and I kind of just fell into it. It was something that I'm not saying I had some great knack for. I'm not saying I'm, like one of the premier students of any of that kind of stuff. I just was really interested in it. And once you're interested in the origin stories, of the people, you get sort of interested in the origin stories of the ideas. And that's one of the things that I think is really sort of fascinating, is where do our ideas come from? And as you and I have discussed many, many times, I think most ideas that get peddled as new ideas are very, 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 very old. And because human nature doesn't change. And so most really, I don't want to say Judeo-Christian ideas are among the only new ideas worth speaking of, in some sense. They're not the only ideas worth speaking of, but like most of the things, communism, Marxism, fascism, socialism, all of those, a lot of those isms are really just very old sentiments and orientations gussied up with new verbiage. But this idea of the sovereignty of the individual, the idea that there's only one God and you have a special sort of relationship with that God, um, the idea that all human beings have dignity, um, that's a really new idea in human history. And it's one that our brains kind of don't want to believe. And that's why we get a lot of bad politics. But that kind of thing, I don't know, I just always found it very, very interesting.
The This is really not the rabbit hole that I plan to
You
go
told me I
down.
could go rabbit holing, so
No. Your rabbit hole is great. I'm about to
okay.
open a crack that I'm wary of my own tendency, because last week I interviewed Ruth Weiss, and I had a whole set of conversation that I wanted to get to, and the first conversation derailed us, and we never got back. So I can foresee this happening. So I'm
Give you
warning
carte
myself.
blanche to make sudden turns. This is your podcast, so do whatever the hell you want.
Thank you, sir. The point about one God, I think it's important thinking about why the one godness is radical, even for, I would say, many secular listeners who don't necessarily see the why is having one sky daddy more meaningful than having 17. And I think this is something that often gets lost in the conversation about the Judeo-Christian roots of liberalism, because you have so much of the anthropomorphized God associated with modern religion, whereas I would locate the real radical nature of monotheism in the essence of oneness, which is more maybe more deistic, maybe more founding father deism, but has that singular force that you answer to, as opposed to an anthropomorphized deity, because that deity doesn't matter if it's if it's that one deity, human like deity sitting alone in the sky, or if they're surrounded by an Olympus of competing forces. But if that one force is not really human like, if it is something that is outside of our scope of understanding, and against which we have to measure ourselves and combat ourselves, then it is more akin to the source of rights, and the source of dispassionate justice that I think is at the roots of liberalism. Does that
Yeah, I
make
mean,
sense?
yeah, it does. I mean, I think there's an easier way to illustrate the point, and Walter Rosamidi did a great essay a couple of years ago called the A bomb, and the A about I don't remember the full title, but the A bomb in this sense was the A stood not for atomic but for Abrahamic, and the whole. I mean, you're one of the guys who turned me on to some of Tom Holland's books a while back, and he makes this point on a whole bunch of fronts. But we can just the one I have in mind is just simply science, right? There are a lot of secular people out there, a lot of atheistic people out there who have a passionate commitment to science, and we can get into a conversation about how that sometimes leads them to what Friedrich Hayek called scientism rather than actual science, but that's a different topic. And one of the things that monotheism does takes time, has to get run through a bunch of different thinkers and all that. But the whole premise of monotheism is that the entire universe is built according to one being's design. And that means that the rules of the universe are the same everywhere. And that is the gateway drug. That is the entry point for science, because science says that the universe is knowable through reason, right? That the new universe is discoverable because it is designed with immutable laws. And so the deism stuff that you're talking about, which comes very late in the story, is sort of a rational, I don't want to say conclusion, but the next step in a lot of that logic, which basically says God set up the universe and then left his workbench, right?
Although
And
I should push back, it comes late in the story relative to what we're talking about, the trajectory of human experience. But deism really is, Maimonidism, and it's really some kind of Aristotelianism where you have that force that launches action, and then use the metaphor of the period of the century, whether it's a clockmaker or a
sure, if
you
that's
know,
fair, yeah,
but
but like there's a view that used to be considered racist and right wing, and then for a while it became enlightened and left wing, and now I don't know who subscribes to it and who doesn't, and who's racist and who's not, given the confusion of these days. But I think the term is polylogism, and it's this idea that different people, different ethnicities, different races, different types of people, um, fundamentally think differently, that their logic is different than your logic, and that it's unbridgeable. And you can see how this leads to a lot of identity politics stuff. One of the progenitors of identity politics in the modern era was the counter-revolutionary, reactionary, ultramontane Catholic um, writer Demeist. And Demeist has this famous line where he says, or he's ridiculing the Declaration of Rights of Man out of the French Revolution, and he says, you know, I've met Frenchmen, I've met Russian men, I've met Prussian men, I've met Englishmen, I've even met, thanks to Montesquieu or something, Persian men. I've never met this person called man. And there's a layer to which that is correct, right? No human beings are raised to be abstractions. They are raised in a context, in a culture. And so that level, it's defensible. But beyond that point, you get to this, what he was really casting shade on was this idea that regardless of these epiphenomenal cultural differences between different religions and creeds and ethnicities and skin colors and all this kind of stuff, that there's any common humanity to everybody. And that's a kind of sort of that the skepticism that either that shared humanity exists or that shared humanity is particularly important, I think, is the source of a lot of bad thinking. But the idea that shared humanity, that sure, people are different all over the place and there's diversity of cultures and all that, but at the end of the day, every human being is made in the image of God and has innate dignity. That is something that you get out of monotheism, and as interpolated by everybody from Maimonides on, and St. Augustine and all those people. And that's a hugely important change, because in the prehistory, just as there were a lot of different kinds of gods, and bad things happened because the gods were bored, right? The gods, picked fights with each other and would kill each other's pet humans. And, there were gods that were sort of like, there was sort of a service contract between us and them. And it's like, if you wanted good crops, you bribe them with, certain sacrifices. If you wanted to win a war, you bribe them with other sacrifices, and you went to different gods for different stuff and all that kind of stuff, all that kind of thing. And what monotheism does is say, no, 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 no. It's one universe. It's governed by the same set of moral laws. And that means that those laws are discoverable through the tradition of reason and some other things, right? Some people say through revelation too. Okay, that's fine. Um, and that's what we owe in terms of radical new ideas. And we can get you probably know better than I do where the origin point is, where the idea comes from, and we could argue about it, but I don't care. The point is that whenever the idea shows up and starts to spread, that is radically transformative about how human beings live and interact with each other.
Right. That unity of forces and that rational order, those are the revolution. And I think that gets lost. That was the rabbit hole. That gets lost in the word, of there is one God. Like, well, because people can interpret so much. And, there was a version of, I forgot the name of the cult, but there's a sect. There's a sect in Islam that believes in the one God, but believes that the one God implies total lawless arbitrariness.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore the laws of nature aren't really discoverable. And there's no, it's a defiance against any kind of inference. So the fact that the sun comes up today, that's because God decided to allow the sun to go up for the past few million years, does not mean it will happen tomorrow. You cannot assume that God's will tomorrow will not change.
Yeah, I think we can say, all things being equal, that view is wrong.
Yeah, we cannot dispositively prove that.
No, we can't. I mean, all these things require a certain degree of pre-commitment and leap of faith, right? But like, I think Einstein gets closer to the reality of things, which is that God doesn't play dice with the universe. And we may not understand the rules of the dice game he's playing, but there are rules to the universe.
So just to close the loop on 2-3 conversations ago, I am interested in kind of getting your sense of, and this we don't need to linger on that, but because media criticism is not our main passion, but I am interested in you come in to media through the back door of think tanks and basically the conservative movement. And then where do you find your voice in media? Is it primarily through your first book, or through blogging, or through punditry? And how does that world change over the past 20-30 years?
Well, I mean, I don't want to get accused of like memory holing anything, but there are a lot of people who first ever heard of me because I was Lucien Goldberg's son, and I got dragged into the Lewinsky scandal stuff. And dragged, I use a little advisedly. In some ways, I jumped in with both feet. But I had been a writer and think tank nerd before that, and so there was a very annoying tendency for a long time for people to say that the only reason I am who I am is because of all of that. And there was certainly ample truth to the idea that I got a lot of name recognition out of it, and I probably skipped a lot of steps that I otherwise might not have. That's fine, but I've made peace with all that. I would say, so in terms of my place, I have a very hard time gauging this kind of thing. I was the founding editor of National Review Online, and I was one of the very first bloggers. I was blogging before we had the word blog. And if you're going to do the begats, Mickey Kaus got the idea for his very then once influential blog called The Kaus Files from the Goldberg File, which is this thing I wrote for National Review, and now I write for the Dispatch. And Andrew Sullivan got his idea for the Daily Dish, which was his even more influential blog, from Kaus, and therefore by extension from me. And you can do these begats all day long. And so
you're the House of David.
Yes. Yeah. So there are a lot of long time readers at this point who still associate me with the early days of National Review Online, and I will still get emails from them talking about the old days. And we used to have this jokey nickname for some of my hardcore fans 30 years ago as the Flying Monkeys. and I still have people sending me emails saying I'm an OG flying monkey, yada yada yada. Um, and then I wrote my first book, Liberal Fascism, which we can talk about. I am perfectly willing to defend the first half of it, no problem. I'm willing to defend chunks of the second half, and I'm not willing to defend other parts of it. Partly because I would have written it differently if I wrote it today, and partly because conservatism has changed so much in ways that I didn't think it would. Um, and that book sort of bumped me up to a much bigger level. I eventually ended up on Fox. My first contract was with CNN in the early 2000s, and then I was on Fox, and I was on Fox for 11 years as a contributor. And then Steve Hayes, the co-founder with me of the Dispatch, we both quit Fox in response to well, for me, the last straw was Tucker Carlson's lies and garbage propaganda about how January 6th was an inside job. And I was like, I can't start up a media organization
That was
dedicated.
a documentary that he released on Fox, Patriot Purge.
Yeah, Patriot Purge. And it was smarmy, shit eating nonsense, very just asking questions kind of propaganda and conspiracy theory peddling. And given the sort of the mission statement of the Dispatch and just my own ickiness of having to be associated with it, I quit with like 12, 13 months left on my contract. And so I don't know. I meet people who know me now because I'm a CNN guy and they only know me as that. Some of them, say, hey, Jeffrey Goldberg, it's great to meet you. Um, and um, and then there's a hardcore people at the Dispatch.
There will be a singularity moment where you and Jeffrey Goldberg converge. That will happen.
Yeah, that's not going to be the most attractive human being. I'm just going to tell you that right now. But so I don't know. I've always worn a lot of different hats, and I think it's one of the very few career strategies that I think has not only been vindicated, but has been proven more important than ever, not less important. There are a lot of things that people made bets about where the media was going 30 years ago that didn't pay off. And my strategy, in part, maybe because I grew up around editors and writers and that kind of stuff, was I always wanted to have was portfolio management. You want to have enough different gigs going on where if you lose any one of them, you can still pay your rent or your mortgage. Wear different hats, that kind of thing. And also I was a very wonky, nerdy writer when I started writing, and very deliberate. And one of the great things about being one of the early bloggers is you learn to write fast and you learn to let stuff go. And so I partly had this strategy is that I just wanted to get to a point as a writer where if someone put their hand over the byline, they could say, this sounds like Jonah Goldberg, because that differentiates you from the crowd. And that's also pretty good advice for young writers. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to write funny. It doesn't mean you have to write about a specific topic. It just means you need to find a voice that works for you. Um, um, and so, I've been a syndicated columnist for 25 years. I've been an LA Times columnist for 20 years. I used to be a USA Today contributor. Um, just do a bunch of different things. And I think it's also good for mental health to have these different venues where you have slightly different personas and identities.
Hey, this is where we are in my case. This is yeah, but the this is a good segue to you're developing your different avenues as a merchant of letters to talk about. I mean, I've set us up as focused on words because I do think that for both of us the there was a love for words qua words, and I suspect that this is, I mean, I don't know if it's true about you, but I'll confess that for myself this was always part of my fascination with the both interesting and garbage literature coming from the postmodern corner of the university, and by corner I mean the university, American University particularly, because it almost took words too seriously, and in a way that went almost in the way that gave that like a fatidic, creative, godlike power over human society, as opposed to in almost direct contradiction to the Orwell's approach to politics in the English language of words as a tool for clarifying, for
Mm-hmm.
directness. And directness and clarification implies that there is a real there to be clarified, and language is just a tool that at best does its imitation of reality as good as it can. Whereas from the postmodern perspective, language is the swirl of forces that defines reality. So I think it's from that interest, from that fascination, and from those questions that we both approach some of our work, and I suspect why we both had some more serious engagement with questions of postmodernism. But it's also, I suspect, why you found yourself over the past couple of years really protective of the word conservatism
Mm-hmm.
and what it does and doesn't mean, and how the creep of political realignment in America has reclaimed, declaimed, unclaimed the status of conservative and right wing. So give me a little bit insight into where you are right now about what is a conservative, and are you a conservative?
Yeah. So I think you're right about this fundamental divide, about this sort of conflict of visions about the role of words, right? And I'm glad you mentioned Orwell, because his Politics in the English Language, I'm not a big like, here's your reading assignment guy, but if you're interested in just a whole slew of different things that boil down to what language is for and what politics is for, um, it's really probably the best essay ever written that hits the sweet spot on that. And it's one of the very few essays that I will reread every couple of years, um, just because you forget how much more stuff there is in it. Um, and so, yeah, I think there's a there are some people, we don't have to call them postmodern, because I think I had mentioned earlier that I don't think a lot of ideas are new. Um, this idea that words are more important than reality, or define reality. I mean, Francis Bacon wrote about this, idols of the mind, I think he called them. Um, you can go back to Plato in this. And in fact, Plato's a good example of this, right? It's like,
Right.
there are some people who think the shadows on the cave wall, since it's not so much that they dispute that there isn't something casting the shadow, but there are, the Stanley Fish kind of argument would be, sure, there's a reality out there, but we'll never know it. So the only thing we have to work with are the shadows. And so let's think about the shadows. And I think that's epistemological bullshit, but it's interesting. And so there are people want who think that if you just change
And
the
the implication in Plato's cave that you could chain people to see the shadows and therefore narrow their entire epistemology.
right. And so like the idea that if you can control the language, you can control everybody's
Exactly.
mind, is it's a very seductive power worship kind of approach to language. Um and I think it's common to humans. And I think part of the role of the intellectual, the philosopher, the and frankly the journalist, right, is to work really, really, really hard to make sure that you don't confuse words for things. That words describe things, but they are not independent of things. And um, you get, there's a grand tradition among political consultants that if you could just change the way we describe something, you'll make it popular or unpopular. And obviously there's some truth to that, right? I mean, the conservatives got a lot of success out of the death tax. George Lakoff wanted to rename trial lawyers into community protection attorneys. Um, and so I'm not saying that none of that stuff ever works. I think it works a lot, and that's a problem. That's why you need to have what Confucius called the rectification of the names, which is every now and then you need to make sure that the words we're using for things actually describe the things that exist in reality. And so I still call myself a conservative, but I always have to qualify it, right? I always have to say I'm a conservative of a pre-2015 variety, or I'm a Reaganite conservative, or I'm a Burkean conservative. I have to find some context that establishes what I'm talking about and what I'm not talking about, right? And so I think one of the things that defines the right these days, and the right is very different than conservatism, right? Think about it this way: if the political right is a continent, right? Let's say the world is actually divided between left and right, which I'm less and less enamored with the left right thing, but let's say it's divided between left and right. There's this little straits of Gibraltar in the middle between these two vast continents we can call the center, and then there are these two vast continents, and one is called the left, and the other one is called the right. There are countries or kingdoms or realms, whatever geographic term you want to apply to them, that you could say are conservative. But there's a vast wilderness beyond that realm that is called the right. So conservatism is part of the right, but not everything on the right is necessarily conservative.
So before we will get to the left right divide in a few, as and the French Revolution metaphor that got stuck with us for better or worse. But what what do you define? What do you see if you have to look at them as continents? What do you see as the essence of the divide? Is it temperament, or before not conservatism, before between left and right now in America? Is it temperament, or is it substance? Is it ideology?
But I would say weirdly, temperament is, it's funny. I haven't really thought about it in these terms. If you're just going by temperament, um, then a lot of conservatives of my stripe have a lot more in common with a lot of center left people than they do with a lot of right wing people, and then the center left types have with a lot of hardcore left wing people. I mean, Jonathan Rauch and I. Jonathan Rauch is this brilliant guy, scholar at Brookings, left of center dude. Um,
Author of the Kindly Inquisitors.
Other the Kindly Inquisitors, one of the foremost. He and Andrew Sullivan probably are the two intellectuals most credited with the triumph of the arguments for gay marriage. Um, I can talk to Jonathan Rauch or Yasha Monk, right, who I still think is a center left guy, um, much better, much more easily than I can with a lot of the jabronis and gargoyles in sort of Fox Newsmax universe, because they care about facts, they care about um, um, making good faith arguments. They're open to correction if you can demonstrate that they got the numbers wrong, that kind of stuff. And that's a temperamental thing as much as it is, it's not solely a temperamental thing, the belief in and reason and facts and making good faith arguments and all that kind of stuff. But some of it really is temperamental. It's just sort of saying, no, it's hard to know the world, and it's hard to know, and nobody has a complete um monopoly on correct opinions. And so when engaging with people who have that kind of epistemological
Humility.
humility, um, it's kind of not that interesting if their philosophical priors make them want a more generous welfare state than I do, right? I mean, like, I'll disagree with them about the welfare state stuff, but like that's less interesting. So there's a lot of commonality like that. I would say that what the I still think the old sort of Tom Sowell um typography has some, or Yuval Levin, who you've had on here. He had this great book based on his PhD dissertation about the arguments between Edmund Burke and Thomas Paine. And he says that those are, as much as anything, the real origins of the left-right divide. And so the schema I'm talking about that I still think has some analytical heft to it is this idea that the more left you are, the more utopian you are, and the more right you are, the more reactionary, I guess, you are. And when I say reactionary, I I, I don't think that's really the right word because there's a lot of stuff that the left calls, there's a lot of stuff that the left does that I would argue is reactionary too. But this sort of idea of falling back on nostalgia for the past, this idea of falling back on really old kind of gut instincts about the role of women, about racial differences, all these kinds of things. Um, uh, the a relationship towards power. There's a lot of that. There's a real difference between left and right, aesthetically and
Aesthetically,
psychologically.
but both of them share a form of utopianism. One of them is the utopianism of the future of we are just 7 tweaks away into our tax code to impose total justice and serenity, and the other one is what we're just a few dates away from dialing us back to the right decade where everything was perfect. But both of these are essentially forms of utopianism.
Yeah, I mean, at the very least, they're. I mean,
Especially as they are exhibited today on the right, because the dial back to wherever as increasingly on the right seems to be less about let's dial us back to a time when we had more individual choice, but rather this is when things started. This is when we took the wrong path, and anybody who is trying to keep us on the wrong path needs to be destroyed because they're preventing us from reclaiming our dignity as humanity or as Americans or as whatever.
yeah. So I want to be careful about this. I'm not saying your characterization is wrong. I'm just saying here's how I would use different terms for it.
Mm-hmm.
Is that so? First of all, I would point out that it wasn't really until like the 1830s that people talked about utopianism as a thing to be achieved, right? Utopia is a neologism coined by Thomas
Thomas
More,
More, yeah,
right? And it's a merger of Greek and Latin to mean no place, I mean
right.
a place that can't exist. And so it used to be a way of deriding people who are impractical and fanciful and silly, right? And then with the weirdly with the births of statistics, it becomes this thing about science has figured out how to reconcile all the contradictions and make perfect this land and society in general. and and so the left picked up a lot of utopianism. That's where a lot of socialism comes from, and certainly where a lot of Marxism comes from. And um and I would say that the stuff that you're talking about in terms of this shared view on the far right and the far left, or in some ways the mainstream, the popular left and the popular right, is popular frontism. Is this idea that um, we all have to be aligned about a singular destination of where we're going to bring society, and anybody who falls out of rank, anybody who points out any problems, anybody who says, hey, I don't think this is going to work, or hey, I think you guys are screwing this up, that person is treated as a traitor. He's anathematized, he's excommunicated, he's a heretic. And that sort of thinking, I would argue, I mean, the reason why Popular Front was normally understood as a left-wing phenomenon, but I think there's an enormous amount of Popular Front thinking on the right these days. And I think in some ways it's much dumber than the left-wing one, because at least the left-wing one is galvanized. It's centered on a lot of pie in the sky idealistic ideas that I think are stupid and unachievable. But like, if they could work, they'd be awesome. And like, it comes from a hope for humanity. And the Popular Frontism on the right is about whether or not Donald Trump is a friggin' god, and like, and whether this guy should be deferred to in all things. And that the cult of personality Popular Frontism on the right, I find profoundly embarrassing for the people who subscribe to it, and profoundly embarrassing for the country.
Okay, allow me to indulge in grotesque reductionism.
Sure.
Isn't it at bottom both of any kind of popular front and aspiration to a redeemed world? Let's put aside the word utopia because that's part of what we're debating, but there's a fantasy that is very human and to use your language is by no means new, to imagine that we can reach a redeemed world.
Yes.
The idea of a heretic is a person who is getting in the way between us, our tribe, to get to that world. And I'm not sure, and maybe it's in my old age, everything becomes fuggy and samey. So I'm just more tolerant of gross reduction, but I'm not sure that there is a fundamental difference between the urges that guide the left in search of a utopia in defiance of reality. You know, the commitment
Mm-hmm.
to engineering despite hundreds of years of failure and just thinking the next tweak will be it. The next tweak will be the one that will get us there. And the right's fantasy that is backward looking, that we were banished from Eden and we just need to everybody needs to agree on what Eden was so we can get back to it.
No, look, I think you make a very good point here. And I'm with you on the gross reductionism. I think a vast amount of the clever idea marketing for positions, the pretextual, dogmatic uh, salesmanship for different ideologies is really just coats of paint on some very, very old ideas and human tendencies. And, I think in some ways what you're talking about, which I think is very closely tied to utopianism, and again, these could be splitting hair kind of things, is
So we're here for
uh, the sacralization of politics, right? I, I'm a big fan. Um, I write about it to the point where people make fun of me about it. The philosopher Eric Vergelen had this phrase, immanentize the eschaton. And William F. Buckley liked it so much that when he ran for mayor in New York, they actually had campaign buttons printed up saying, don't immanentize the eschaton. And
catchy.
Yeah, it's a wonder he didn't win. And in short, to make imminent makes to make something in the here and now, to be manifest, tangible, right? And the eschaton is the afterlife, is that which is reserved for beyond this world. And so another way of understanding what immanentizing the eschaton is just simply trying to create a kingdom of heaven on earth. And if you just do a basic kind of, forget deep dive, like almost just a Google search of the phrase kingdom of heaven on earth, you'll find that Marxists use it, American progressives used it, um, Jacobins would use it. I mean, like, even though they didn't believe in God and all that kind of stuff, it's this idea of making this life holy and sacred. And even, we get the term totalitarian from Mussolini. He's the guy who coins it, and he didn't mean it in the Orwellian sense of a jackboot stomping on a human face. He meant it in the sense of holistic, of like everyone belongs, everyone's in it together. And this idea that we can import religious understandings into politics, I think we'll both agree is very, 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 very old, right? This distinction between religion and politics is actually very, very, very new. And that, in ancient Rome, ancient Greece, there was no like, oh, we've ventured from politics into religion. It was all in the same stew. Um, and so the when I hear the hardcore kind of crazy Christian nationalists and the others talking about a golden age, or Trump is the chosen one and all that kind of stuff, or when I heard people like Oprah say it about Barack Obama, what I hear is the blood-brain barrier between religion and politics being breached. And that, I think, is a human universal. And it's sort of, I think, what you're getting at with the utopian thing, insofar as, yeah, so like the cultists on the far right, they define their notion of the, sacred community, the corpus sanctum or whatever you're supposed to call it, in the past. And that's a really stupid way to think about the past. And the left, which thinks it is largely free, and this is a gross generalization because there are a lot of people on the left, certainly historically, who were religious, but there are people on the left whose idea of a sacred polity, of this sort of transcendent thing, who like loved hearing Obama talk about we are the ones we've been waiting for, and we are days away from a total transformation, right? This idea that you could sort of take communion in politics and live in this new sort of sacralized space. They see that more in the future. They think the past is a thing to escape from, and the right sees the past, broadly speaking, as a thing to escape to. And as someone who is a conservative, I think it is hugely important to look back on the past and say these are the things worth holding on to. These are some of the things that got us to where we are, and therefore should be carried forward. And these other things, that's the dross that, while we're panning for the golden nuggets from the past, when you find the crap that gets in the way, you get rid of it. And you should be humble and incremental about your improvements. And you should be grateful about how good you have it compared to the people who lived in the generation before you, never mind the 10 generations before you.
Maimonides, who talked about God as something that's beyond our understanding, and learning, not just beyond our understanding, beyond our language. And to learn God, to study God, to love God, for Maimonides meant study nature, because this is the only mediant that we have to think about the divine in a meaningful way. And anything else is either absurd or heretical. Just deal with nature, which we know is the product, the creation. And he had such harsh language for messianism, including Jewish messianism, because he saw that as a rejection of the here and now. It saw it as that obsession, either forward-looking or backward-looking, to a period that completes the errors of the now, as opposed to loving the now. And for Maimonides, to reject the now and obsess with a Messiah that will bring your absolution, your world absolution, is to hate God, is to hate because you hate the world. That's what I was hinting at. That I think there's a thread of Judaism that is very much in tune with the liberal idea, and
For sure, yeah, I think that's right.
And that's both the constitutionalism and the idea of a law as a binding force, a called indifferent law, as opposed to a personal law, disinterested law. And the other part is a focus on the here and now and a rejection of messianism. Arguably, the split between what we now call Jews, the Pharisees, and the Christians, was around the question of messianism. Whereas in Christianity, on one hand, Christianity laid the foundation for a liberal world order. As Tom Holland points out, you don't have liberalism without render unto Caesar. That's what you were pointing to before, the split between the secular and the divine. But within Christianity, because it also had that messianic impulse, it contained that constant that tension. And I think Tom Holland also addresses that as the unending cycle of revolution that exists within Christianity. And you develop the new model for better society, and you find that same human corruption in your own society, so you turn that over. And that's it from the Cluny monasteries in France that were supposed to be, again, to use the word utopian, and then were corrupted, and then the Franciscans, and then the Reformation, and until where we are today. And arguably the French Revolution is just part of that same cyclical journey. I'm thinking about this because it also reminds me, in contrast, I don't know if you've read any Islamic scholarship, but Sayyid Qutb, who is one of the parents, intellectual parents
of Islamism,
Islamism, and specifically the Muslim Brotherhood, he referred to the Western world as or to the problem of the Western world as the repugnant schizophrenia because of that splitting between the secular and the divine, as if that was a split that was never meant to happen, and then human nature constantly craves to reconcile those two, and in that dissonance you find all the corruption and malaise of the Western world. That's why the Westerners are so sad. That's why they use drugs. That's why they're so debauched. It's that schizophrenia that Christianity created. And I think weirdly that so much of American politics right now basically agrees with Sayyid Qutb.
Yeah. So let me back up on this a little bit, because I think this is a really interesting point, and it gets to something that you and I have talked about in the past about how I often think that ideas are sort of, we focus on intellectual history because it's written down, it's legible, you can argue with it. Um, it's like the drunk looking for his car keys under the street lamp because the light's better there, right? Um, and I've been using this line for 30 years now, but the automobile did more to destabilize settled communities and families and transform society than any ideas that escaped some German lab, mutated in France, and then came here like a zombie virus, right? Like Foucault, Derrida, Sartre, you can take them all. Frankfurt School Marxists cannot hold a candle to the transformations that the Buick wrought on society. But you can argue with those guys, and you can't argue with the Buick. And there's just a rich history of intellectuals who, because they are intellectuals, want to argue that the intellectuals drove everything. And I say this with some trepidation because I love intellectual history, but there are many ways in which it is not that important. And so on the Qutb thing, it's also worth pointing out that, like, there's a weird variety, of left winger and right winger who kind of wants to give, two cheers to Qutb, for the point that you're making. And, Dinesh D'Souza wrote a really terrible book called The Enemy at Home back when he was still in good standing and among a lot of people. And his whole point was that social conservatives in America should find common cause with quote unquote social conservatives in the Islamic world. And the funny thing about Qutb is, so he came up with all these ideas about the West from like a summer or a year long. It was briefly lived in, I think it was Greeley, Colorado. Greeley, Colorado in like 1959 or whenever it was he was staying there. This was not debauched Weimar Germany, right? This was like among the most like settled, quaint, happy days kinds of places. And the song that made him freak out and decide that basically Western civilization needed to be torched was Baby, It's Cold Outside. Right. So like there are these people who say, well, you got to hand it to them. And they're like, like it's true. If we wanted to go back to the 1950s, that would be so much better. Wholesome nuclear families, all that kind of stuff. Qutb thought that shit was profane and degraded and sexually corrupt, right? Because you could see girls' ankles when they walked down Main Street. So not to get all technical on this, but fuck that noise. That's all nonsense. Now,
although I'm old enough to remember 2014, where many commentator on left-leaning startup outlets were obsessed with Baby It's Cold Outside as, rape culture.
Yeah, no, I know exactly. But like, it's not a song about sexual assault, by the way. But even if it were, which is not, it's just not a song about sexual assault. Like, and therefore what? We should put all the women in burqas? I mean, I can't square the circle on any of that stuff. So, but the reason I went into this thing about how ideas are not necessarily that most important, this notion that it's the cognitive dissonance, that's this psychic disharmony of wanting the sacred but living in the profane of Western liberal individualistic culture that breeds decadence. I gotta say, one of the things that really breeds decadence? wealth. And I I don't want to cast aspersions on anybody in particular, but I put it to you that there are a lot of Muslims in good standing in Dubai and Riyadh who do profoundly profane things because they can afford to import underwear model escorts into their homes and pay them good money to do it to them. And when they don't pay for the escorts, they do things to their house slaves because they can, and they have power and they have wealth. And so the idea that somehow if we all lived like we live in the Emirates or in Saudi Arabia, everyone would be in perfect harmony with God's moral dictates, I just think is hot garbage. The Borgia popes, right? They were popes and they did all sorts of dirty stuff. And so the reason why, where the only place where I agree directionally with a lot of these kinds of things, and it was basically the plot of my last book, is that human
Suicide of the
nature,
West.
Suicide of the West, is human nature is permanent, right? Like the you could argue, at least among my kind of conservatives, the fundamental insight of conservatism is that human nature has no history. That you can't say, oh, 1,000 years ago, the building blocks, the factory preset of human nature was any different than it is today. And so the only thing that improves humanity in a civilizational sense are the ideas and the institutions that inculcate them. And so the problem that you face in every generation is that human nature is always, like nature itself, always trying to find a way, right? Water seeks its own level. You clear a field, if you clear a section of the forest or the jungle and then you leave it alone, the jungle grows back. If you put a grandfather clock or an outhouse in the middle of a field in nature and leave it alone, termites will eat them both with relatively the same pace. As Horace says, you can chase nature out with a pitchfork, it will always come rushing back in. And so one of the reasons why you should be mindful of the past and grateful for the progress that we've made is that we wouldn't have any of that progress unless we had made strides in conquering human nature. Humans aren't all evil, but nor are they all good. There is a depraved side to human nature, and there's a glorious, charitable, altruistic side of human nature. And there's a lot of stuff in between. And so the thing I like about, you know more about Maimonides than I ever will, but like one of the things I like about Maimonides, and one of the things I like about, my dad always used to make this point about Jews. He says, one of the great things about Jews is the phrase l'chaim, right? To life. It's like, this is the life you get. Try to be a mensch. Try to live it like a good person and make a positive impact in the world. And not some grand theory about perfecting the world or, immanentizing the eschaton or anything like that. Just don't be a dick. And I think that like too much of our politics gets caught up in this sacralization stuff that we are, as you say, like I said, I made reference earlier to scientism, right? There is like agnostic, atheist, secular people hate hearing this, but there's an enormous amount of religious impulse in technocracy. Again, it is this idea that if we just turn the dials just the right way, we'll get to this perfect click point where harmony, just rushes in and everybody lives fine and everybody is happy and everybody is taken care of and all good things will go together and we'll have the unity of goodness and all this kind of stuff. The conservative view is a fallen view. It doesn't believe in, utopia with a U, but it does believe in e-utopia, which means a good place, a place that is better than the alternatives. Doesn't mean
This,
it can't be made better.
the
But
same EU from euphonic.
right, or euphonious, yeah,
Oh,
yeah. And like that's all you can hope for. Like you can't want a perfect life. In fact, you're going to come much shorter of achieving a perfect life. You're always going to come up short, but you're going to come much shorter of a perfect life if you think you can live one. the trick is to try to live a good life. And that means you're going to make mistakes and you're going to learn from them and you're going to say there were mistakes rather than own them. And I think that one of the things that defines, utopianism historically, or is necessary for utopians, is this idea about the perfectibility of human nature. You cannot make the crooked timber of humanity straight. You cannot make people perfect, but you can give them arguments and incentives and institutions and support that make it easier to be good than bad, and make it easier to make the right decisions when the right decisions are really important, than you would otherwise. And but people are always going to put. I mean, there's this what's his name? It'll come to me. But there's a sociologist who has this list of human universals, and which is one of the things that runs against that idea of polylogism, right? This idea that there are different ways of thinking everywhere in the world. Everywhere in the world, there are like hundreds of things that are common to every culture, like a generalized taboo against incest, right? A taboo against desecrating the dead. There are all these, things that, a taboo against, harming your own biological children. I mean, and they're not iron laws, because there are people who harm their own biological children, and there are people who get into some cold play with dead bodies, and there's all sorts of things. People do bad things, but human nature is a thing. And if there's this idea that somehow, no, it's really not, that we're blank slates, that the state, it gets back to this stuff we were talking about before, about if you can just control the words or the shadows on the cave, you can create the perfect humans that will live in perfect harmony with your perfect society. Was it Plato says in the Republic that if you give me 3 generations of kids, I can create essentially a utopia. And it's just not true, right? It's like you need constant vigilance to sustain these institutions and these rules that have improved humanity a lot in the last 300 years. And the problem is that Western democratic capitalism is not just the best system ever conceived of for prosperity and conquering poverty and all sorts of other things. It's in creating wealth, right? It's the only one. And the problem with it is it doesn't feel like it. It doesn't fill people's the holes in their souls. It doesn't give them the kind of meaning that they want. And so all of these isms, regardless of whether they're left wing or right wing, are all sort of designed to fill the holes in our souls, to give us meaning, to make us feel like we're part of something bigger. And they'll promise different baubles and rewards, right? I mean, there's all this tariff bullshit and protectionism stuff that they say, oh, it'll make us like the 1950s again economically. It won't. But it's part of this sort of idea that if we could just arrange the economics of life in a certain way, we will achieve the kind of perfect people and perfect society that we want.
To give ideas their place, right?
Mm-hmm. I'm not anti-idea.
No, I know.
Yeah.
Well, obviously. But beyond being fun, and or maybe it's once again an indulgence, but and this also kind of sets up our previous conversations about Strauss and Straussianism and esoteric knowledge. There is an assumption that some ideas can cause social harm or social impact, let's say, as when they get mimetic and they inform behavior. That's how you get culture. Culture is the product of intellectual artifacts that get transferred. So ideas do also define whether or not you get material progress. And specifically, I want to this has been on my mind since the weekend, because I got into a fun, very Jewish shouting match with a dear friend and artist, the great artist that I admire, Ken Goshen, exactly about that, and to what extent ideas should be curtailed because of their impact. And I want to give us a specific focus point. Rousseau. We both see Rousseau as in his writing, his work, not necessarily his writing, because many people who even quoted him during the French Revolution didn't really read him, but have him as a pamphlet in the book. Carlyle calls it the Gospel according to Jean-Jacques. His ideas, whether the actual things that he wrote or the idea of his ideas, were incredibly charismatic. And not because they were original. Recently, I was reading Bastiat's The Law and preparing my next semester's class. And Bastiat quotes you in 1850 about there being no new ideas, and he says, those people who read Rousseau thinking that they're leading the progress were only 2,000 years too late with their ideas. So it's not that it's new, but it clearly tapped into something charismatically. It had a power to put fire into a sense of rebellion against injustice that led to the ultimate purge of the French Revolution. Now, a small disagreement that you and I had was whether that charismatic power starts with Rousseau or, in my view, it is more Jacobinism. But because I think that the real charisma long term from that period is not the social contract or the idea that we were all born free and forever in chains, but rather that fire purges. That fire is the guillotine is the path to social redemption. I think that idea ended up being more charismatic over the next 200 years and defined especially the 20th century in terms of revolution at scale. But either way, those are mimetic images. Those are that we have in Western culture as a path to this social redemption. Whether it's we need to renounce the social constraints and the language and the baggage that previous generations have imposed on us in order to find our true authentic self, or whether it's that the only way to really get to our authentic self and our freedom and equality and fraternity is through the guillotine and the bloodshed and the constant self-purging. That created what I've been half jokingly calling the annihilist tendencies in modern society. It's obviously it's part of human nature, but it tapped into it and highlighted it. And I think now we can see how charismatic it is. Those are ideas, right? That's not a material. The material change is the changes in media and in communications that have allowed for annihilism to reach scale more than it did in the French Revolution, even though the French Revolution was already an upscale of what revolution could have been before that, right? It was globalized. The original globalized intifada was the French Revolution. So first, do we take them as ideas that have true charismatic power to disrupt the sort of liberal order that we appreciate? And if so, what do put on your Straussian hat and ask yourself, what do we do about this intellectually? Do we just combat these ideas as we do in the public square, or do we realize that as long as these ideas are publicly available, even when they do have a grain of truth, like they are contagious and therefore potentially dangerous?
It's a really interesting point. And let's just say for the sake of, before I say for the sake of the argument, let me say up front, I'm willing to concede that the cleansing purge, the great do-over, right, is an idea. I'll stipulate that. But now, for the sake of argument, let me say why I think it's something different than an idea.
I want to hear you, but I would even call it, it's almost like an earworm more than an actual fleshed out idea.
So that's sort of what I'm trying to get at. And I am not a Jungian, and I don't know a lot about Jung, right? But I do think there are some things, let's put it this way, okay? There's some things that ping our psychological sweet tooth, right? That we're really receptive to. And one of the ones that I think is just irrefutably true as a generalization, I'm sure there are listeners out there who reject it entirely for themselves or think they reject it entirely for themselves, probably a little of both. But as a generalization about human nature is this idea of the big man, right? The leader, the tribal chieftain, the king, the emperor, the redeemer, the father figure who protects his children, who are the people, right? This is an idea found everywhere in the world forever, like long before written language. Like, this is how tribes organized for the most part. Yeah, I'm sure we can find some exceptions to the rule in the archaeological record, but this is basically one of these archetypal sort of uh, emotional receptor concepts that human beings respond to. And this is sort of what I was alluding to when I said earlier that I think there's a lot of left-wing stuff that's actually reactionary. You know, the cult of personality around Mao, Stalin, Castro, you can go through a long list, you know, Ortega. Um, uh, you can say, oh, well, it's different because it's a left-wing regime. I don't know that left and right are particularly meaningful terms when you're talking about dictatorships. I mean, in foreign policy, that's a different argument, but like in terms of like how normal people live and how the society is organized, it would actually take you a lot of time for you to explain to me and convince me that Fidel Castro wasn't a fascist or that Mussolini wasn't a Castroite, right? The guy walking around in a military uniform all the time, wanting to organize society along military lines, command and control over the economy, complete illiberal views on speech, one party state. I mean, you can just go down a list, you know, over and over.
Enamored with his own voice.
Enamored with, gives crazy long speeches. And so that's one of these ideas that is, let's call it mimetic ideas, right? This is one of these ideas that I think takes on a new and interesting color because of Christianity. This idea that there's some violent act of redemption that you could do at scale for the whole society. And there's a Jewish thing that comes into this too, because it is amazing the degree to which, first of all, it's amazing how so many people who love the French Revolution refuse to acknowledge that it is the birthplace of European nationalism, right? It is where this nationalism stuff basically comes from. And where it doesn't come from the French Revolution, it comes from the crap it had invited by invading Germany and arousing it there. And it is amazing how much the rhetoric of the chosen people and the chosen nation infects the Jacobins. And you know, when the French Revolution starts, they're very pro free speech, and then very quickly they become anti free speech because they think there's this, you know, like, you know, there was that lese majesté, you know, this right of a king. There becomes what they start calling the lese nation, whatever nation, right? With this idea that there's just some things that the nation has a right to protect itself by clamping down on speech and assembly and all these kinds of things. And so anyway, this idea of purging, of wiping the slate clean, starting at year zero, getting a do-over, has deep and abiding appeal to human beings. But it's a pre-intellectual appeal, right? And one of the great problems you get into with any sort of political argumentation is the anthropomorphization of society or of nation states. That the nation is like a person, it's a body politic, we're all organs of one corpus mysticum and one giant sacred body, and the king or the president or the dictator is the homunculus brain of all of society, and everything has to work in harmony and all that kind of thing. And that idea is another one of these, because like it's tribalism, right? Is this idea that we're all in this tribe together and everybody outside the tribe is dangerous and the other. And so much of left-wing ideological stuff and so much of right-wing ideological stuff boils down to that. And so I agree with you that the ideas matter, but often what those ideas are doing is serving as marketing for that much baser lizard brain idea about social organization or a big man or tribalism. And I think that the do-over thing, which also, you know, has deep roots in, like, it used to be up until, there's a wonderful essay by what's his name, Daniel Boorstin, about, it's called Saint Augustine's broken wheel or something like that. And he talks about how the fall of Rome, one of the great things about the fall of Rome is it shattered the idea that history was cyclical. This idea that we just, we're all like the Cylons. We're all doomed to repeat this stuff, and like there's a plan, and you start in a Edenic pass, and then you have a golden age, and then you have a bronze age, and then you have corruption and decay, and then you start the loop all over again. That was a very common way of thinking about history. And Augustine is the guy who says, look at all the stuff we invented over time. We still got that stuff, right? It was this idea of material progress mattering. And I think that but that idea of the cyclical nature of things, that like every now and then we just need, sort of like in The Godfather, every 10 years we just need a big war to get the bad blood out of the way. There's something that really appealing to a lot of people about that. There's also, I think, and this I think applies more to the Jacobins in general. I know I'm just free associating now, but is that if you have a technocratic mind, and I don't necessarily just mean like in the strict meaning of the technocratic mind, if you have the arrogance of intellect that says, I know exactly how society should be organized, but these stupid people won't comply, right? That these damn square pegs won't fit into my far superior round holes. The temptation to use state power to replace the people, was it that line from Brecht or somebody about, how, in the West they have elections to replace the leaders, and in the East they have elections where the leaders replace the people, or something like that, right? Like there is this idea that says, this was Stalin's population policy. This is, Lenin liquidating the kulaks on trumped up charges. This is, and it's this idea that says the people can't get their souls right, so let's get rid of these people and get new people. And I don't think that's common to all human beings, but I think it's pretty common to human beings with unrestrained arbitrary power over other human beings.
But that temptation, this temptation, this is the nihilist temptation. Let's get rid of the people with a bad soul. Isn't just restricted to the people in power. The people in power have the clear incentive to do that and replace their people to more pliant, obsequious people. But usually they're supported by half the population or third of the population.
Yeah. No, mobs are a problem too.
No, but mobs feed a tyrant. A tyrant lives off the power of the mob, and that's where the mimetic power of annihilationists,
for sure,
social purging ideas has its danger. And again, this is if you're being a little pessimistic about what you're seeing in the tendencies of the Western world today, like you can see how this mob fieriness is becoming louder. I don't know in terms of percentages how big it is, but it is becoming louder. This is the technological change that is allowing the mob to be heard more than it is proportionally represented. But it is unnerving to see it happen, which leads us to the question that you skirted about the Straussian question. What do we do about these ideas? Do we do we just trust the, if you're saying that the part of it is the anthropomorphizing of society, so do we just put our trust in the counter idea of, that thou shalt not make an image, counter idolatry? Don't do idolatry to a nation, a tyrant, or anything. Don't worship your leader, don't worship your nation, don't worship your land. And those who will get it will be, de-radicalized or re-liberalized. Or do we say we need to be tyrannical ourselves with this information? We need to be Straussian.
So, first of all, I don't think
is humanity not ready for the truly radical liberal ideas that have given its nihilist tendencies?
So, first of all, I don't.
Personally, I don't share it. I'm trying to do the best to represent my friends' ideas.
I just want to. We don't have to explore it, but I want to just reject what was probably just rhetorical excess on your part, this idea that Straussians are tyrannical, because I don't think Straussians
No, no,
are
no, no,
tyrannical.
no. Of
Right.
course not.
So, and I'm not a Straussian. I'm not smart enough to be a Straussian. But
No, but
and
in the Straussian question of esoteric knowledge, there are two aspects. There is writing containing truth, like protecting truth in a world that wants to destroy that truth. But there is also the aspect of protecting truth from the masses who can't handle that truth. There
yeah,
is
or
that
at
aspect to
least
it.
protecting truth tellers or
Truth,
truth
right,
holders,
right,
right
from the mob.
from the
But
mob.
also because the mob not but there's a paternalistic side to it because society can't handle the truth, right? That there is that element to it. That's the Maimonidean Strauss. It's funny, you probably arrived at Maimonides through Strauss, and I at Strauss through Maimonides. But the point is to protect the social cohesion, the social order from the deeper truths that might endanger it, because it gives the mob those earworms that it can't contain without lapsing into anarchy.
Yeah. So, just a couple thoughts on this. One, one of the things I think people don't appreciate enough uh, is was it the first commandment? I am the Lord thy God. Thou have no other gods before me. Right. I'm not Tomer Persico. I don't. I'm not a biblical exegete or anything like that. But it seems to me there's an interpretation of that, which is to say, don't turn anything else into the divine. Right? There's only one divine thing, and it's this guy. I'm pointing my thumbs upward, and I don't mean guy in a gendered sense, right? And because the problem is, once you deify anything else, you get into trouble. Some kinds of trouble are worse than other kinds of trouble, but it's trouble, right? Mammon, right? You can deify money, you can deify sex, right?
Land.
Land. There's a thing in um this my brain is so fried. There's this theologian pastor guy who has this great quote that whenever I write about how I don't like crowds, I always quote, who makes this point that clergy are really good at about dealing with two of three kinds of false transcendence, sex and drugs, essentially. They're really bad about dealing with the transcendence of crowds. And crowds and mobs, right, are a kind of mass man, right? Whatever you want to call it. This idea that this group, that we are more important than anything and our will be done because we're so angry about something, right, is a real kind of transcendence. People lose themselves in mobs and become part of some larger thing. And I think there are a lot of evolutionary reasons for that tendency. But it's a thing. And so there is definitely a thing that we could call mob worship. Um, and the demagogues that I was talking about before, I think you're actually right, absolutely right to point out that there are large numbers of normies. I shouldn't say normies. There are large numbers of non-leaders who call them followers, who are the effectuators of demagogues and dictators' will. I think that has always been true. This is one of the reasons why I do not like the more extreme nationalism gets, the more I don't like it, because again, a little nationalism is fine, but it very quickly gets into the poison is determined by the dose territory. And one of the reasons for that is all mob organizations of any kind, I don't mean mafia, I mean all mass movement type things, they need, just for practical purposes, a leader, right? Usually it's a charismatic leader. And what nationalism tends to do is anoint that leader as the avatar of the nation. So therefore, disloyalty to the avatar is disloyalty to the nation. That makes you a heretic. That makes you, a traitor, yada, yada, yada. I prefer, and I've been arguing about, I've been making this point for 30 years now in 3 books. One of the things I like about liberalism, um, and by liberalism in this context, all I mean is like the best versions of the Western political tradition, that you can get from Maimonides as much as you can get from Burke or
Well,
Mill or
best
whatever.
best based on your white phallocentric biases.
For sure. But it's just basically this idea that the irreducible political actor, not the irreducible social, I think there's a very strong case to make that the fundamental social institution in any society is the family. But the fundamental political actor in any society should be, and in the West generally is, the individual. And so therefore that means that typically the best version of the American, Anglo-Saxon, Western story is that the hero is the person who stands up to the mob, not the mob. It's the person who says, you're not going to hang this guy today. You're not going to lynch this guy today. We're going to have a trial. We're going to follow the rules. We're going to follow the law. And when you tell a mob that you're not going to lynch someone, what you're doing is you're saying, don't listen to human nature. Don't listen to your bloodlust. Don't listen to your tribal desire for revenge. Instead, listen to that small, still voice that is the better part of you that says, no, we're not going to become animals. We're going to do this the right way. And maybe this guy really does deserve to be hanged. That's always possible. But if he does, we're going to find out by having a trial and doing it the right way. And that's The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. That's To Kill a Mockingbird. That's, that is the best version of what America is supposed to be about. And I think at its core, it gets a lot from Judaism and it gets a lot from Christianity. Fell far short of it for centuries and centuries, and we're probably falling far
Gets
short.
a lot from the Roman
And
Republic.
it gets a lot from Rome, right? So I mean, there's the whole Athens and Jerusalem thing, right? So which gets me to Strauss. I'll get off that and stop ducking your question. We are not going to get into the Bloods versus Crips of West Coast Straussianism versus East Coast Straussianism and what's the difference and all that kind of stuff. But I'll simply say, again, borrowing a little bit from Yuval, is that all Straussianism is this time, as Yuval would put it, this timeless conversation between the most serious thinkers about what a just society looks like, what a best society looks like. And there's a profound arrogance inside of Straussianism and inside a lot of Straussians, that they have some sort of Gnostic insight into what might be the answer to that. But part of their answer is it depends, because history is contingent, human nature is flawed. There's a reason why I said I wasn't going to get into this, but there's a reason why the West Coast Straussians love Lincoln so much. It's because Lincoln was a passionate defender of the best version of what America was supposed to be about, right? This is Harry Jaffe's argument about the Gettysburg Address and about how it finally put the Declaration of Independence in the right place as the jewel of our philosophical worldview, as an American creed and all that. And he was defending that order, and he was trying to get us to a more perfect union. And because he was trying to do that, he was right to break the rules of the Constitution and liberal democracy. That's this weird Straussian tension, is like, when do statesmen need to step outside of the rules of the thing that they are there to protect? And I think one of the reasons why a lot of those West Coast Straussians, to borrow a term from clinical science, lost their fucking minds is because they spent so much time talking about these great men of history who leapt outside of the norms to save Western civilization, that they started looking for it where it wasn't. And they started turning Donald Trump into this Red Caesar kind of garbage thing. And they had to catastrophize and apocalypticize so much about how bad America was to justify trying to turn Donald friggin' Trump into Abraham Lincoln, which I don't think can be done. And, but that point is still a good one. There is a truth there, that there are moments where the stakes are so great that getting caught up in the proceduralism can lead you astray. I passionately believe those moments are profoundly rare, and it requires an enormous amount of trust on my part for me to even entertain the idea that someone should have extra constitutional, extra legal authority. And one of the ways I test my own heuristic for understanding whether or not they should is whether they lie a lot. And if you have to lie to convince people there's an emergency that doesn't exist, then you are a power hungry demagogue and not Abraham Lincoln. And I think one of the things, I mean, you heard me talk about this a million times, but like one of the things I think progressives in America that led them so astray is they had a pretty radical contempt for the rules. They thought they're technocrats, right? They thought, oh, all of this musty, fusty stuff from the 18th century about divided government and checks and balances and all that kind of stuff, that only made sense as an alternative to monarchy. But now we got slide rules and assembly lines, and we know how to do everything. And so the greatest example of this is
algorithms and AI.
And now it's algorithms and AI. It's the same idea, right? And Woodrow Wilson is the guy who says we have to get rid of the Newtonian American Constitution and replace it with a Darwinian one. What he means by that is he's bringing in that corpus mysticum, that idea that United States is a country that it's an organic being, and all our institutions should be like organs of the body and work in unity and not against each other. And I think, and so it's really kind of funny to me, not necessarily in a ha-ha way, but so first of all, so Wilson's attitude towards Lincoln is the most morally perverse take you can have, which is that he loved Lincoln's abuses of power, suspending habeas corpus, shutting down some newspapers, that kind of stuff. Loved that stuff. What he hated was the cause that he used those things. Right? He hated the ends of winning the war, defeating the South, and ending slavery. He thought that was corrupt. But the abuses of power and the suspensions of constitutional and legal norms, that stuff he thought was great. And so that was Wilson's idea of power, right? He just loved the power utilization of Lincoln. He hated the moral means of it. And today, the foremost Wilsonian in American life,
he hated the moral ends of it.
Yeah, he hated the moral ends of, he loved Lincoln's means, hated Lincoln's ends. And the only sane, decent, humane position about Lincoln is that some of his means were regrettable necessities, but his ends were wholly justified and laudable, right? Saving the Union, ending slavery. These were good things, not bad things, right? And anyway, the single most Wilsonian guy out there these days are two people, Donald Trump and Stephen Miller. These are people who make Wilsonian arguments. There's some Jacksonian stuff in there too that says the president is the only person who's elected by the entire country, and therefore he has these, supra-constitutional, extra-constitutional authorities. He is the avatar. He is the manifestation, the Volksgemeinschaft made flesh. And therefore, who are these senators and congressmen and judges to stand in his way as he's going to redeem the society and bring in a new golden age? That is very similar to the Wilsonian arguments about treating national elections as if they're sort of plebiscitary things, and that confer a mandate. The word mandate doesn't exist in the Constitution upon presidents.
I mean, important to note that there was a lot of that kind of rhetoric surrounding Biden as well.
Oh, yeah, and certainly around Obama. I mean, like this, but this gets to the point. I said earlier that there's this thing in us that likes big men, that likes leaders, that likes, I'm not saying, likes Führers. And I don't mean this necessarily in the sense of Hitler, but of this concept of the Führerprinzip, this idea
Big
of
L leader.
Yeah. Yeah. And Wilson has this really amazing speech you should read sometime called Leaders of Men, where he gets into how you have to craft language in a way that inflames passion and causes mobs to cohere towards justifiable ends. And I hate it all so much. And uh and so these arguments that you get about the Alien Enemies Act and the trading with the Enemies Act and all of these are all pretextual for just saying Trump needs to be allowed to do wherever the hell he wants. And they use constitutional verbiage to justify or rationalize all of that kind of stuff. And it's all bullshit. It is just this big manism, this leaderism, taking on the accoutrement of supposedly sophisticated arguments and language and permission structures to justify strongman stuff. And that strongman stuff, like, so this is where we get back to where you were talking about, is like there are ideas about strongmen that are very sophisticated and smart and erudite, but it's all just selling the sizzle of this red meat, much older archetypal instinctual idea, and that comes from human nature. And my problem with an enormous number of intellectuals is they don't see it. They get so caught up in the way that fish don't know they're wet in the superstructure of their ideas and their schema and their paradigms and all this kind of stuff, that they can present these big tomes or these lengthy essays or these brilliant lectures, and then the kid in the room who has the emperor has no clothes moment and says, so what you're talking about is a strong man. No. It's much more sophisticated than that. No, it's not. And similarly, like with the postmodernist stuff that we started with, like there's this great scene. I don't know why it pops into my head, but in there was a spin-off from Buffy the Vampire Slayer called Angel. Anyway, there's a scene where these demons from another dimension come in and they're screwing with Earth and all this kind of stuff. And the good guys are trying to stop them, and they're trying to cast some spells on this demon guy who's playing with the entrails of one of his victims. And the demon says, "Are you trying to use word magic on me?" Like, word magic, blood magic. Blood magic's where it's at, right? And he's talking about like blood magic is so much better. And when I hear people talk about like the power of words to transform, and I think words really do matter. I want to be really clear. People who say they don't believe in labels are not thinking through their position. But labels reveal and distort at the same time, and they're only partial conveyors of reality and all that kind of stuff. But when I hear people talk about language as a way to create a reality, that perception is reality and yada, 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 I always think of a word magic. Are you just going to use word magic on me? Anyway.
That's a great loop. Well, thank you, Jonah. I'm gonna sign you off with our standard question, and just because of how we got distracted, we didn't even get to the conversation that I've been meaning to have with you for a year and a half about what are your heuristics for black humor, dark humor, and
we can talk about that if you want. I mean, I had to clear my schedule to talk to you for an hour, and I don't, It's...
So let's not go too long, but I am curious about this. What dark humor for me is like the lifeblood of a good conversation, and it's very difficult to know sometimes, especially when you're switching cultures, as I have from a very openly, in Israel, it is a rite of passage to find your own Holocaust humor, your own strand of Holocaust humor. And in switching cultures, you need to relearn what the boundaries are and also what is being communicated by the joke. It's not just boundaries. It's like realizing that for example, the other week I was reading Ruth Strauss's book, Jews in Power, and I was on the subway and I was getting nods from people, and I realized that they're not getting nods for the right reasons.
Yeah. That's funny. That's like a New Yorker cartoon. You have someone sitting there on the subway reading Jews in Power, and like a dude with like a Globalize the Intifada t-shirt. It's like, exactly. Yeah, thumbs up, and a rabbi thumbs up, uh,
So
so
how do you approach this question? How do you sniff out?
yeah, so look, I mean, part of the I used to. There was a time when I actually wanted to write a book about not a humor book, but a book about humor, because I think there's some really fascinating philosophy, most of which I've forgotten at this point, about laughter and why it is and what comedy is. And but one of the threads on laughter is, I'm not sure how true it fully is in terms of psychology, but I think there's a truth in there, is that laughter is one of these things that we all have these tensions between different aspects of reality, right? That we don't know how to reconcile, how, like, the weirdness of life, and it kind of exists in our heads in a pre-rational place. And that's one of the reasons why observational comedy works, is because it's this thing that says, did you ever notice, wow, the one wobbly wheel on the shopping cart or whatever? And you thought you were alone in noticing that. And then all of a sudden there is this sort of Kierkegaardian leapy moment where, like, holy shit, I see it gets you out of your solipsism. And it's like, these other people in the room laughing at the same thing, they had the same sort of irreconcilable, like, isn't that weird kind of thought about things, right? And that's why so many jokes are about race and sex and all these things that are difficult to talk about, but we have so much anxiety about. And then when you find out the demystification of the topic at the same time is a kind of mystification of the topic, because, oh my gosh, it's a communal insight. It's not just my own. I'm not alone. But it's a really profound sort of metaphysical thing, I feel. And so the it's one of the reasons why comedy clubs are among the most communal places in the world, is because you kind of get this cathartic thing of realizing you're part of a broader humanity kind of thing. And I saw, to get to your actual question, I think that it's not just cross-cultural in terms of, like, Israel to America or France or anything like that, although that's obviously part of it, right? Because I remember, we might have talked about this before, where when I lived in Prague in the early 90s, I went to see the Naked Gun movie that came out at the time, these Leslie Nielsen sort of slapstick comedies. And there's, a new remake, reboot of it with Liam Neeson these days. And the movie was funny. It wasn't as funny as the original one, and it wasn't as funny as the TV show that it was based on, but it was funny. But the audience was falling out of their chairs at certain really slapsticky kind of jokes about how stupid the cops were. And it was explained to me later that, yeah, that's because in then Czechoslovakia, it wasn't two countries, under the communists, you weren't allowed to make fun of communist leaders. That was too dangerous. And so the subject of sort of what we used to call Polish jokes in the United States were street cops, because you weren't a street cop unless you were too dumb to get accepted into the Communist Party, right? It was a much lower status thing to be. You weren't a KGB or whatever the equivalent was. You were like, a normal beat cop who could be reprimanded and overruled by some commie bureaucrat at any given moment. And so the repository of that kind of transgressive humor were beat cops. And so making jokes about how stupid cops were hit in a way in Prague that it would not have hit in America, right? Because in America, it's funny because this guy is stupid, not because all cops are stupid. But there, the cop thing was a categorical thing, and it was a really interesting kind of example for me, at least. And then, but there's also just like, there's a reason why laughing at the same jokes is such a huge part of friendship, of romance, right? I mean, because what you find funny is hugely tied to how you see the world itself and how you see your place in it. And so what can be really, really funny jokes between two friends who trust each other and know that they're coming from the right place when they tell the joke. Like if I heard you say a Holocaust joke, it would not offend me the way it would if some rando I met at a think tank function did, because it's like I just haven't done the due diligence to know that he doesn't mean it in a really, really bad way. I know you are not pro Holocaust, right? You know, like that much is established. And so I think that's part of the trick, is having this sort of good faith. You're part of the club, you're in
Right.
on our thing. And like, I have all sorts of problems finding those people in America with other Americans. I have a handful of people who I can tell really dirty or inappropriate jokes to. And then there are other people who I still consider really close friends. Like I consider Yuval Levin a huge influence on me and a dear friend, and he's a colleague and all that kind of stuff. But there are jokes I would just never tell Yuval that it's probably unfair to him. He'd probably laugh at them, but like I would feel uncomfortable. I'll give you a big example. David French, who is also a mutual friend. David French, evangelical Christian, now writes for the New York Times, used to be a colleague at National Review and then at the Dispatch. He and Sarah Isgur have this legal podcast called Advisory Opinions. And Sarah, I can tell dirty jokes to all day long that I would never tell David, because it's just, there's a cultural
Right.
mismatch there.
Even though he would take it in good spirit.
Yeah, no, for sure. It just I wouldn't feel comfortable telling
it's
him,
off.
right?
It's
Yeah.
off.
And
but then there's the other side of the context is I saw I think I told you about this. I was in the Comedy Cellar like a couple of months ago, and Chappelle came up for a like surprise secret show, and he said, you know, he said like people ask me why don't I make jokes about the Jews, and it's not just because the Jews own all the clubs. it's also that whenever I make a joke about the chosen people, I see all the people in the audience that cheer, and I'm like, I don't like this vibe. And I thought that was so you can tell when somebody is laughing one way and when somebody's laughing type B.
Yeah.
That's not what that's not the joke that I was making. And I actually a few weeks after hearing Chappelle say that, a friend of mine took me to a comedy show in Boston, which was exactly that. It was like a middling comedian who was just trying to be really edgy and talking about all the races and all the, and it just, I mean, I didn't love the comedy itself, but I really didn't like the vibe of the audience.
Yeah. It's so, I mean, it's so about telling Jewish jokes. Like they're not, I personally just not into very few Holocaust jokes that land for me. But plenty of Jewish jokes land for me. It just like, like, I mean, it's just, we don't have to start, I don't want to do a five joke test about which of your Hollis jokes I think are funny, but
that's for another time, and with votes.
Yeah. So like, but like the there's also, I've written this before, but there's a funny thing about how I always used to say there's a reason why comedians are overwhelmingly drawn from the ranks of Black, Jews, and gays, and Canadians. And I'm serious about the Canadian part. Like the number of Canadian comedians is just, and comedic actors is just staggering. And I think part of it is, just to stick on the Canadians for a second, is a lot of them grew up on American pop culture, but they had just enough critical distance from it that they could spot the weird connections between things that people who grew up in it can't. And so like Jews and Blacks have a similar thing, right? Jews and Blacks, they have to know their own minority culture and the majority culture. And since they're not completely in the majority culture, they have that visitor from Mars thing where they can see the weird irrational connections between things, the did you ever notice stuff that the the normie Americans don't necessarily see. And it's interesting once you start thinking about it in those terms, the number of comedians who are actually from mainstream white culture, right? I mean, like, um, is much fewer than you'd think, because there's a class aspect to that too, right? I mean, it's like so much of comedy is a fish out of water. Look at these strange people I'm around, kind of thing, and so um, it's that it's that critical distance that I think is sort of the key thing. But anyway, I'm just rambling. Um,
Actually, not at all. It's such a good insight. The outsider insider, which is like, it's so there when you think about it, but it's true. And Canadians are the Jews of America.
in a lot of ways, no, I think that's right. I mean, like they are, because and look, and it's also one of the reasons why. Um, so like one of these things. So I'm trying to avoid, given the context of this conversation, too many examples from Nazism, but the thing that comes to mind is a little bit the some of the some of the most disproportionately evil Nazis weren't from Germany. They were from Austria, starting with Hitler. And there is this thing about having your identity be bound up in this thing that you're actually not part of, that makes you lean into it so much more than you would, if you actually grew up in it and you knew where the sort of the limits and the diversity of your own culture are. And so you get people like some of the absolute worst globalize the intifada types are people who have a caricatured idea of what it means to be a Palestinian or a Jew, right? It's this um, abstract archetype kind of thinking that you can only do if you actually don't grow up inside one of these cultures. And um, and I think that there's a sort of much milder version of this that is much more beneficial, which is that some of the best Americans are immigrants precisely because their version of America is the idealized one that they saw from far away. One of my favorite essays by a friend of mine who died about 10 years ago, Peter Schramm, whose father was a Hungarian um, who escaped at the tail end of World War II, literally was like at a, I think, as standing at a firing squad when the Allies started dropping bombs. I was like, all right, we're out of here. And Peter asked his dad, he's like, why are we moving to America? And he says, because we were born Americans just in the wrong place. And like, I think of my father-in-law, who literally swam the Danube to escape the communists, came to America with nothing and became this hugely successful guy in Alaska, because he had this idea about America that was much more, in many ways, idealistic than the reality of America. But believing in the ideal let him achieve it. And you get more of that from immigrants than you get from people who are born here. It's like, it's my whole thing about the children of super rich people are not only some of the crappiest Americans, but they're the crappiest rich people, because at least the people who made the money have an appreciation for it and what it took to get it. The people who take their wealth for granted, there's a reason why so many children or grandchildren of billionaires or robber barons or whatever you want to call them end up being really just pain in the ass, spoken word poet, foundation, trustafarian jackwads. It's because they have this utopian idea about how the world should work. Life came easy to them. It should come easy to everybody, kind of thing. Meanwhile, the immigrant who comes here and says, holy crap, do you realize how lucky poor people are to be poor people here rather than someplace else? They have a much better version of America. And I think Jews, one of the things they bring and brought to America is they have a much deeper historical sense. They have a much greater appreciation for the tragedy of history, and they have a much greater appreciation for how friggin' awesome this country is. Now, most Jews are way too left wing for me, and that's a whole other conversation. But they bring with them this idea that America is so unbelievably good for the Jews. And I don't mean because it supports Israel. I mean because it rewards the kind of things that Jews, as a habit of the heart, value: educating their kids, creating opportunities for the kids, family cohesion, sense of community, to come along about, helping the world. You can go down a long list. Like, America is incredibly conducive for some of the best things about Jews. And that's one of the reasons why I find Holocaust jokes not just offensive because the Holocaust is gross, but there's a thing about
Hot
anti-Semitism.
take.
Yeah, there's a thing about anti-Semitism in America that I think, my friend Cliff Asness wrote about this for commentary not too long ago. There's a thing about anti-Semitism in America. There's also just anti-American that is anti the idea of merit, right? Because if you believe in groups being, if you have this sort of Ibram Kendi point of view that says any disparities between large groups of people must be the result of outside forms of bigotry and oppression and unfairness and systemic bias and all that kind of stuff, then as a matter of logic, you have to believe that any groups that overperform as a group must be beneficiaries of some sort of rigged system or conspiracy. And anti-Semitism, and also the anti-Asian stuff to a large extent, is really in many respects a form of anti-Americanism, because of the whole idea of, or anti-liberalism, this idea of individual merit and freedom being the the best way to create a sort of um aristocracy of merit and all these kinds of ideas. And the war on merit is bound up in a lot of this nonsense. And so anyway, um I think that's one of the reasons why people are a little more uncomfortable about Jewish jokes than they are about a lot of other kinds of jokes. But I also think it's one of the reasons why Jews made such a massive contribution to this country, is because this country let them. And no other country in the history of the world, at least until Israel was found, reliably let Jews pursue the individual pursuit of happiness the way America let Jews do it here. And not just Jews, but, Jews lived in a way that it was like they were waiting for their emancipation for thousands of years, um, to be able to do the things that liberal democratic capitalism rewards. And that's why I find the illiberal anti-Semitism so rampant out there m- more pernicious in some ways than other forms of bigotry.
I really need to think about this. I definitely agree with you that there's something anti-American inherent in the American form of anti-Jewishness, and maybe generally there's just such a link and link in the mind of the anti-Semite between the Jew and American liberalism. But it's also interesting. Your point basically is that prosperity needs, for the maintenance of prosperity, you need gratitude and humility, and it's difficult to sustain humility and gratitude when you were born into it.
Yeah. And this is obviously true.
Into prosperity, that is.
Yeah, this is obviously true. I mean, like I worry about this with my own kid, right? Just this idea of taking things for granted, right? Um, it is a problem for every parent about, like, how much struggle and suffering do you want your kid to have, because at the end of it it'll make them better. But one of the things that I think is just very powerful and very good about Jewish culture, not uniquely so, I think a lot of immigrant families have this kind of thing. My wife's not Jewish. Her dad, my father-in-law's village was taken over by in in turn Nazis and communists, and he saw a lot of bad things and literally had to flee the country because he made too many jokes in 10th grade. And but he always told my wife, when she started getting sort of intellectually ambitious and wanted to go to a good school and be um pursue an academic career kind of thing, he said, look, if you really want to if you really want to do that, you really want to test yourself, you got to go to a school with Jews at it. And he said it lovingly in a philo-Semitic way. He's like, I mean, he got a master's from Milton Friedman at the University of Chicago, surrounded by Jews who just took this stuff super, super seriously. And I think that one of the reasons why Jews do that is because Jews have, more than most other peoples, this appreciation about how shit can go bad really quickly, right? I mean, like from reading the Haggadah forward, the story that Jews tell themselves is hold on to what is precious right now, enjoy life while you can, because things can go south. And by inculcating even very prosperous kids with those internal things, and they use too much guilt to do it, and they do all sorts of things that I don't love about Jewish culture, but it works, right? And you've heard me make this point a million times about how this idea that immigrants and Jews and other sort of minorities, the idea that they educate their kids to make them rich is meliorist, reformist nonsense, right? Because that's the argument you get at scale. It's like the more we educate our people, our population, the richer we'll get as a country. That might be true, but the reason why parents educate their kids is as a hedge against poverty, not as a guarantee of wealth, right? And like the Jewish mother wants their kid to be a doctor or a lawyer, not because they'll become super rich. It's because it's really unlikely that they'll be extremely poor and they'll have enough money to raise a nice family and deliver grandkids. And that is a cultural habit of the heart survival strategy that Jews by rote just have. And at least the ones who sort of stick with it, there are a lot of, people who've left that cultural milieu, and I'm not super Jewish, right? But that part I'm comfortable saying is real, and that I know it. And so it's kind of this point about gratitude in miniature. You should be so lucky, you're doing, you could do a lot worse, right? And that appreciation for what you have and how much worse it could be. What is the song from? Was it from Fiddler on the Roof? It's not from Fiddler on the Roof. The song that they begin every episode of the commentary podcasts.
Oh yeah, I know. I think it's a Mel Brooks film.
Yeah, it's hope for the best, expect the worse. I mean, talk about a Jewish bumper sticker, right? And I think that that's something that is just that worldview, for all the flaws that it has, um, is extremely valuable, and it arms people for success in free societies and for survival in unfree societies, um, in ways that I wish more people would copy.
Eh, eh, כל המוסיף גורע. So so I'll just leave it with our before I inject my natural pessimism. I'll just ask you our
Yeah, what's your exit question? Because
exit question.
I know I'm rambling and stem winding and filibustering.
No,
So I apologize.
on the contrary, this is I have my dear friend is going to meet me for dinner later, and I'm like, am I comfortable making her wait an hour? So our exit question is, which is in a way what we've been talking about all for the past 2 hours. But what is the blind side? What do you see as the blind spot on the left and the blind spot on the right? What do you see as like blind spot or something that the left doesn't see in themselves as a flaw, and a flaw, and something that the right doesn't see in themselves?
Yeah, I mean, so
or something that the right or the left don't see in the world, that they just have a blind spot about. Ignore.
So I'll just do it about the contemporary left, not historically, and the contemporary right. I would say for the contemporary left, it is the permanence and the unconquerableness of human nature. That human nature matters, I mean, there are a lot of people on the left who will say, "Oh, I think human nature matters," but I don't think they follow through from from that platitude to the conclusions that they should. They're much too married to the idea that if we just get enough data, if we just get the right politics, if we just get the right leaders elected, if we just expand the franchise to teenagers or to, you know, people in prison or whatever, that if we just get the electorate that we really have and deserve and whatever, if everyone could just raise have their false consciousness lifted, we could fix everything, and that we don't need to worry about the importance of incentives, the importance of the fact that all public policies are about trade-offs. Sol would say there are no public policy solutions. They're only public policy trade-offs. It is that, I think, is their fundamental metaphysical blind spot. And the more you understand that on the left of center, the closer you get to being um, a centrist liberal, and the further you get from being sort of a passionate left winger. On the right, I think there's a much more, that I think is an enduring problem of the left. The problem on the right, particularly these days, is a I don't want to say hypocrisy, because I think hypocrisy is overdone and gets us back to a conversation of Rousseau, which we're not going to do for hour 3. Um, but it's it's this true blind spot of understanding that the the rules we said the left doesn't understand also apply to the right. There is this amazing tendency on the largely unconservative right, the new right, but it's encroaching in a lot of conservatives, to say that, oh yeah, all that stuff we said about economic planning, all that stuff we said about the value of checks and balances and of free speech, and pick your thing, right? The importance of the rule of law, the importance of a strong dollar, all of these. I mean, it's an enormous list of things that I still think are true. Um, there's an enormous number of people on the new right, or various camps of the new right, who say, no, 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 that really only applied to the left because they're wrong. We know how to do this stuff. Um, Friedrich Hayek, one of his greatest essays is about, one of his greatest writings is about what gets shorthanded as the knowledge problem. This idea that you can't do economic planning, you can't do um, um, uh, really finely tuned social engineering, because central planners are just never going to have enough information to be better than markets and prices at allocating resources. And this has all sorts of radiating, uh, follow-ons to it, about the folly of industrial policy, the folly of protectionism, the folly of all sorts of economic planning and social engineering stuff. And conservatives all of my life have been making these arguments about this. And then all of a sudden, starting about 5-6 years ago, a bunch of politicians and a bunch of power-hungry intellectuals started to embrace the idea that um, um, no, 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 that stuff's all true about the left, because they lack the insight, right? So, like, my favorite example of this is just Marco Rubio, who I think, in a certain sort of, you know world's tallest midget kind of way, is one of the best cabinet people in the Trump administration. Has been the least disappointing among a generally disappointing bunch. But Marco Rubio has to be at the tip of the spear of new, exciting populist ideas, right? He's one of these guys who's like, there go the people, I must go with them, for I am their leader. He started writing a few years ago this stuff about how, um, I think the headline was literally the the case for industrial policy, comma, done right. And the idea being that, all this stuff about um
We want the good kind of central
Right.
control.
No one's explained to Nobel Prize winning Friedrich Hayek that all of this stuff about the knowledge problem missed the fact that if you just did it right, it would work, right? That our experts were in charge, we could do all of these things. And that applies not just to industrial policy, it applies to, all of these jobos and weirdos and some very sincere and legitimately decent people who were on the right of some correct side of some controversies about free speech in the Biden years. The second Elon Musk takes over Twitter and Trump is in office, they don't care about free speech anymore. They just cared about their speech. And the inability to embrace universal rules, even if it means they will benefit the left from time to time, is the reason I hesitate calling it a blind spot. Is there are a bunch of people on the right who are actually pretty honest about their hypocrisy on this, and they've gotten seduced by these arguments about power. And if we just have power and use power the way the left did, we can have all the good things. And I find all of that grotesque, hypocritical, and illiberal. And it breaks my heart, because this is one of the things I got wrong in my first book, is that I thought that the American right's dogmatic commitment to the rule of law and the Constitution
Gives
and
it an
free
immune
markets
system.
would protect it from this stuff. And I was wrong. They've become detached from the liberalism that is not all there is to conservatism, but is a crucially important part of it. They've come, a huge number of them have rejected it in the name of power politics and crushing your enemies. And I find it gross. And we're going to be having to correct for it for 2 generations if we ever manage to. And so I guess that would be my blind spot for the right.
Fantastic. We brought it back to some pessimism.
There we go.
The
Cheer up, for the worst is yet to come.
Yeah. By the way, a friend of mine, and then I'll end on this anecdote. Sometimes you have a conversation that distills a model that you have of society, or of how some people think in society. And a friend of mine who's generally on the Ezra Kleiny, Paul Krugman-y left,
Mm-hmm.
very planary, but not far left into identity politics. He said to me in passing a few days ago something like, but ultimately the problem is that with the Republicans and Democrats is that uh, Democrats are just too incompetent to succeed and getting power, and Republicans are so competent that they will always be able to implement their sinister plans. And that version is like, yeah, it's not like they were both models of power are of illiberal power is just wrong categorically. It's just that we'll never know whether liberals are truly, or Democrats are truly corrupt, because they'll never be able to. They always lose. That notion of my side always loses, the other side always wins, and when they win, they'll always use it not in a fair game way, but in a way to destroy the system and corrupt the system. That logic is just. I was so shocked to hear it expressed so literally.
Oh no, I mean, like this. I mean, that's David French point about how we've had these culture wars now for 30 years, and both sides have got some of it wrong, because both sides are convinced the other side always wins.
Exactly.
And that can't be the case. That's a blind spot I would put for all humans, is what the evolutionary psychologist John Tooby called the coalition instinct. And it's just basically this idea that we are wired to think that everything in our tribe is normal and everything in the other tribe is, and also in our coalitions within our tribe, right, is like we're the good guys and our inconsistencies are all understandable, and our hypocrisies and our contradictions all make sense in this larger kind of culture thing, but the hypocrisies and contradictions of the other people prove they're evil. And the example I always use, I just think it's really funny, very few other people do, comes from an episode of The Simpsons where the kids are running around, the kids from Shelbyville and the kids from Springfield. They're in this sort of mock Lord of the Flies war with each other. And at one point, the kids from Springfield they find a candy wrapper in the woods near Shelbyville. And Millhouse, the little nerdy kid, says, "Oh, look at the candid. Those kids, everyone knows those kids from Shelbyville, they love candy. They love it for the sweet, sweet taste." And he says it in this way to make it sound like, yeah, that makes Shelbyville kids weird and dangerous and skeevy and suspicious because they love candy. But so do the Springfield kids. But like, there is this thing in the coalition instinct that lets us take normal human behavior in the other and make it sinister. And so much of the culture war bullshit that we've got these days between Democrats and Republicans is, oh, Democrats like candy for the sweet, sweet taste, right? And like, Biden abused power, and everybody who says they love the Constitution is outraged. And then Trump abuses power 100 times worse, and everyone's like, well, Biden did that, and besides, he's doing it for the right reasons, and this is not really abuse of power because he's got good motive. Blah, 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 blah. It's all bullshit. And but that natural human tendency to have this blind spot when your own side does it is one of the worst, most corrosive and corrupting blind spots in modern civilization.
And with that, Jonah, thank you so much. This was awesome.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.